Now go ahead and take off the tie rod end nut. 21mm socket. Let's take this tie rod end nut off. Now you're going to take a hammer and you're going to hit the knuckle right here. And let's see if we can get that tie rod end to fall out. Top nut, 17mm socket. Take the washer nut out of the way. You can take that bushing out. And then the bottom mounting nut is a 17mm socket. So I just took a pry bar and I pried it out from the bracket. So in order to take the lower control arm out, you have to remove the shock. And the shock on this we're going to replace because it's old and broken anyways. And as you can see, the nut is rusted on there, so that's never going to come off with a socket. So we're going to just chisel that nut off and then take the shock out. Now you're going to remove the two lower mounting bolts for the front shock. It's a 10mm socket. Discard the nut and the rubber bushing and the washer up on the top here. So now you can just pull the shock right down and get it out of the way. Now we're going to dismount the caliper to the caliper bracket, and that is a 7mm Allen head. Get these slider pins out of the way, and then we're going to just support it up on the top control arm. You got a bottom one and an upper one. Once it comes out, the slider pin will move right out. The threads are really short, so it shouldn't take too long. Slide it right through that. Now I can just lift the caliper up, and I've got this caliper hook that I'm going to put in the piston and suspend it so that it doesn't pull on the cable. Now I'm just going to remove the cotter pins because it's easy access right now before I support the whole control arm with a jack. So I'm going to take the top cotter pin out and then the lower. So cut it as close as you can, that way you can just put the socket over it and disregard that nut. Take the lower one out, same for this one. Pretty bad, pretty rusted. So just cut it as close as you can. That way the socket will go over, and I'll just disregard, kind of disintegrated. So now I've got the jack right below the spring where I want it. I'm going to add a little bit of pressure to make sure that it's not going to slide down on me. And I'm going to put the socket on. Now because the cotter pin was rusted on there pretty good, I'm just going to have to tap it on. I've got a 24mm here. I fit that right over that rust. And I've got a 1/2" impact swivel and an air gun. And I'm going to take that upper control arm nut right off. Okay, so I got a 23mm socket on there, 1/2" air gun impact swivel. So I'm taking a pry bar and pulling up on this upper control arm because it's independent. So I just want to move it slightly. I'm going to hit the knuckle where the ball joint goes in. I don't want to cause too much movement here. So now that's out of our way, we can just lower this floor jack at a slow speed. Now I'm going to use the floor jack and control the speed of it coming down, because that spring is right under load. We're going to take the lower ball joint out so we can take the knuckle and set it aside. I have a 25mm socket. So I'm just going to take the rotor off at this point because it's going to be less weight. You could do it before you take the upper ball joint off, obviously, or you don't even need to take it off. Mine's stuck on there and it's heavy, so I'm just going to take it off. I'm also replacing it. So I'm going to just put the castle nut back on the lower ball joint enough so that when I hit this, obviously the knuckle won't fall down and crush my toes. So now I broke it free. I'm just going to take the castle nut off, take this knuckle right out of the way. $15mm wrench on the bolt side and 18mm socket on the nut side. Let's take this bolt out. I'm just going to leave it partially in there while I loosen up the front. So the air gun, half-inch air gun, didn't move the nut off the bolt, but a nice long-inch half-inch breaker bar, I got it to move. So the gun should take over now. Awesome. Now we can get this out of the way. So see how it's spinning? That means that that rubber bushing inside is actually attached to that bolt. So now we know what we're up against. So I'm going to put the T55 Torx bit on with a breaker bar. See if I can hold that from spinning. So I'm going to do half-inch breaker bar and a half-inch ratchet. Okay. There we go. Let's see if we can get this up out of the way. Now, nope, so it's going to hit the inner tie rod end. I'm just going to break this inner tie rod end free and spin it off. Now let's put the new control on back up. Just new. Put the front bolt in first. Then put the back one in. Don't be afraid to use a rubber mallet. Okay. So now I'm just going to put the nuts back on, the control arm bolts. I'm not going to tighten them up because I still have to move this and put the knuckle attached. I'm going to torque these at the end once everything's in place. I put a little of medium strength thread lock on that inner tie rod end, and I'm going to start it. Okay, bottomed out. Now I'm going to tighten it up. And this is just a quick twist. Don't do a slow. You don't want this gear spinning inside and ruining the power steering gears. And now I'm going to put the boot back on because I can put a Torx T55 in there with an extension to hold it while I torque, because I don't want to get any dirt inside that could possibly ruin the inner seal. Line up that vent tube and make sure you bring this down to that little notch on that tie rod end. There we go. And reclamp it up. I'm going to see if I can reuse the old clamp. So I'm going to fish it up through here. Lock it into that groove. Yeah, it's in there. So then you just take a pair of angle cutters, just tap it on, make sure it's down in there. And you're going to squeeze this without cutting it. So now I'm just going to transfer over the old control arm bumper. I had to use a screwdriver to pull that out. It's really no good, but I don't have one to replace it, so I'd rather leave that there, and then I'll purchase one. So now I'm just going to use my floor jack again to support this, and I'm going to take the new ball joint castle nut off and take the protective plastic take that and discard it. Now let's get our knuckle and line it up so we can at least get the castle nut on. Then we'll put the spring in and compress it. So now I'm going to put the spring in, making sure the rubber piece goes on the top. This spring is going to seat right in the notch that is cut out. Get all the debris out of the way. And now let's just put them right up in there. The key is just getting that seated right up in there. There we go. Once you can hold that in place, let's get the control arm somewhat, making sure that stays right seated as best as it can. Watch the digits. Watch the digits. Perfect. Now we're going to get our knuckle and mount it to the lower ball joint, tie rod end, and upper ball joint. So let's line up the knuckle on the lower ball joint. Put the new castle nut on. Can't really see. There we go. So now we can install the outer tie rod end. Put the nut on that. And then I'm going to install the sway bar link. And that'll definitely help support this little control arm and attach it to the vehicle. Make sure you remove the shipping plastic. That protects the boot from getting ripped. And then I'm going to take the top off. Let's put the top in first. Maybe we can manipulate this in easier. So bushing, then middle washer, than lock nut. Has a Teflon threading lock on it. And then maybe I can manipulate this, get it lined up. Perfect. Start a couple of threads. Now we'll tighten this all up. 24 millimeter socket. We're going to tighten this up, snug it up, and then we'll torque it to the specs. Torque specs are 94 foot-pounds. Let's see if it lines up for a cotter pin. Whoa, I better go play the lottery. 21 millimeter socket. You can just snug it up. So what happens when you can't tighten it, the spindle's spinning in here? I'm going to show you a little trick. Tie rod end is spinning in the knuckle here from the shaft, so we're going to do it by hand. 21 millimeter wrench holding onto the nut and 10 millimeter holding onto the stud. And we'll just snug it down enough, hopefully we can seat it, and then use the air gun. Let's see if we went far enough. Beautiful. Torque spec is 60 foot-pounds. 21 millimeter socket. So now we're going to tighten up the sway bar link. 60 millimeter socket. I'm just going to snug them down, then I'm going to torque them. So you could try to torque this if there's a torque spec, but you got to be realistic about it. You're going to keep screwing, you're going to screw it down. You're going to keep tightening this down, and it's going to make these bushings this big, like a sandwich. So the proper way to do it is tighten this up until you just start to see them bow out from the washer. And now I'm going to leave it at that. The bottom one says 27 foot-pounds, so we're going to do it that way. See how it feels. So now with the floor jack, I'm going to jack the lower control arm to line up and put the upper ball joint in. And then with a quick little wiggle here, there you go. And now there's enough threads showing. Put this castle nut on. 22 millimeter socket, and I'm going to snug this up. The torque spec is 60 foot-pounds. Now I can take away the floor jack. I had to put an extension on because obviously the fender well is in the way, so I couldn't get a full swing on my torque wrench. "60 foot-pounds, but you've got to line up the cotter pin line. So just a hair more. Perfect. I'm going to put the cotter pin in the lower ball joint, right through that castle nut. So T55 in the front holding that bolt in, 21 millimeter, and we're just going to snug it up. I'm going to snug up the back control arm bolt, 18 millimeter socket for the nut, and a 15 millimeter wrench. So the front nut and bolt is torqued to 130 foot-pounds. And the rear control arm bolt is 80 foot-pounds. Now to finish up the suspension work, we're going to put in the shock again. Just bring it up through the, find the mounting hole on the top, slide the stud through. You get your 2 mounting bolts for the bottom. See if you can start them by hand. $10 millimeter socket. Torque the bottom shock bolts to 21 foot-pounds. So now we lowered the vehicle, and we can put the upper bushing and washer on, the upper shock, part of the shock. This is going to be a 9/16 or 14 millimeter socket. Now it says to torque that to 19 foot-pounds. But in reality, I don't know how you would do that. It would just keep squishing this bushing. So I like to tighten them right till I feel the bushing expand and it's the same diameter of that washer. To finish up this whole job, we're on the home stretch. We're going to reinstall our front brakes. I'm going to put a lug nut on this to stop the rotor from sliding out. Now I'm just going to install the caliper with the pads on it. Take my bracket out of the way. So on this, the pads are identical in the sense that they slide on. There's no seating for them. They slide on right there. So get a little hammer and tap those on. Caliper slider pins are 7 millimeter Allen head. I'm going to put those on by hand, get them to center. We're going to torque these to 26 foot-pounds. Calipers mounted, snugged, 26 foot-pounds. Tighten up those caliper slider pins. Take this lug nut back off, and now we're ready to mount the tire. Torque specs is 85 to 110 foot-pounds. We're going to do it at 100. And do it in a crisscross pattern.